What happens when the galaxy's most advanced species discover that their sophisticated technology means nothing in the face of raw human determination? When alien cadets from across the known universe gather for the most brutal survival training in existence, they bring quantum fabricators, molecular assemblers, and weapons that can reshape matter itself. But there's one human among them who carries nothing but calloused hands and an unbreakable will to survive. While others rely on their advanced gear, he'll show them what it truly means to adapt, overcome, and thrive using nothing but primitive human ingenuity. In the frozen wasteland of Zirion 7, where temperatures drop to -200 degrees and predators hunt with electromagnetic senses, survival isn't about the technology you carry, it's about the fire that burns within. Some creatures are born with natural advantages. Others build impressive tools. But humans? Humans make the impossible look easy, one stubborn step at a time. This is the story of how one species' greatest weakness became their ultimate strength, and how sometimes the most primitive approach is the most effective one of all. The transport ship's cargo bay hummed with nervous energy as 200 of the galaxy's finest military cadets prepared for what many considered the ultimate test of survival training. Markuschin stood quietly in the corner, his simple combat fatigues and basic survival pack making him look almost primitive compared to his fellow trainees. To his left, Zara Th of the Voltarian Empire checked her quantum fabricator for the third time, its crystalline surface pulsing with stored energy patterns capable of creating complex tools from raw matter. The 8-foot-tall reptilian being's scales shimmered with built-in environmental sensors that could detect atmospheric changes from miles away. Her species had conquered 15 star systems through superior technology and careful planning. On his right, Commander Thexla from the Crystalline Confederacy reviewed holographic schematics projected from his arm-mounted interface. The silicon-based lifeform's transparent body revealed intricate circuitry that processed information faster than most supercomputers. His people had developed nanotechnologies so advanced they could reshape entire planets at the molecular level. Behind them, the insectoid hivequeen subsidiary known as X7749 communicated with her drone units through electromagnetic pulses, coordinating their shared survival kit inventory. Each drone carried specialized equipment designed for different environmental challenges. Their collective intelligence had solved resource allocation problems that had stumped other species for millennia. Marcus adjusted his worn canvas pack and checked his basic supplies: a fixed-blade knife his grandfather had made, some paracord, a steel fire striker, water purification tablets, and emergency rations that would last maybe 3 days if he was careful. Compared to the molecular assemblers, environmental suits, and reality-manipulating devices around him, his gear looked like museum pieces. The ship's captain, a gruff Terran veteran named Rodriguez, stepped into the bay wearing the weathered expression of someone who had overseen this training exercise dozens of times. His cybernetic arm whirred softly as he gestured toward the massive viewing screen that dominated one wall. "Welcome to Zirion 7, Rodriguez announced as the screen flickered to life, revealing a world of endless white interrupted by jagged black mountains. "Your survival training ground for the next 30 standard days." A collective intake of breath echoed through the bay as environmental data scrolled across the screen. Average temperature, -180 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure, barely sufficient to support most life forms. Native predators, 17 confirmed species, all adapted to hunt in extreme conditions. Weather patterns, unpredictable electromagnetic storms that could fry most electronic equipment. Zara Th's scales rippled with concern. "Captain, surely our environmental suits will compensate for the temperature extremes?" Rodriguez's smile held no warmth. "You'll be equipped with basic thermal protection only. No powered systems. The electromagnetic interference on this planet renders most advanced technology unreliable at best, completely useless at worst." Thexla's crystalline body pulsed with agitation. "Our fabrication units? Our molecular assemblers? Will work for approximately 6 hours before the planet's unique magnetic field disrupts their quantum matrices," Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. "This exercise is designed to test your ability to survive when your technology fails you. Every species in this galaxy has faced that moment when all their advanced tools become worthless. This training determines who survives that reality. X7749's drone cluster buzzed with frantic communication before she spoke for them all. What are we expected to use for shelter construction? For tool creation? For resource acquisition? Rodriguez gestured toward the basic survival packs stacked near the transport pods. Your hands. Your minds. Your will to live. His eyes swept across the assembled cadets, pausing momentarily on Marcus. Some of you may find this more challenging than others. The human felt the weight of hundreds of alien gazes settling on him. It wasn't malicious attention, exactly, but rather the kind of curious observation usually reserved for interesting specimens. Marcus had grown used to it during his time at the Galactic Military Academy. Humans were still relatively new to the interstellar community, and their approach to problem-solving often puzzled their more technologically advanced allies. While other species had evolved sophisticated biological capabilities or developed incredible technologies, humans had remained stubbornly baseline. No natural armor, no enhanced senses, no ability to manipulate matter at the quantum level. Just adaptability, persistence, and a peculiar talent for making dangerous situations work in their favor. A Medhoran cadet, his gaseous form contained within a specialized suit, drifted closer to Marcus. Human Chen, perhaps we should discuss alliance possibilities? My species' atmospheric manipulation capabilities combined with your. He paused, seemingly searching for a tactful way to describe human abilities. Your documented resourcefulness could prove mutually beneficial. Before Marcus could respond, the ship shuddered as it entered Zirion 7's atmosphere. Through the viewports, they could see the planet's surface rushing toward them, an endless expanse of frozen wasteland broken only by wind-carved ice formations and the occasional dark slash of exposed rock. Deployment begins in 5 minutes, Rodriguez announced. You'll be scattered across a 100 square kilometer area. Your objective is simple: survive 30 days and reach the extraction point. The location will be transmitted to your basic communicators on day 28. Zara-TH checked her equipment again, this time with visible anxiety. Her quantum fabricator could create almost anything given enough energy and raw materials, but 6 hours of operation time meant she needed to make those hours count. After that, she would be reduced to using whatever primitive tools she could fashion with her own claws. Thexla ran calculations through his crystalline matrix, projecting optimal resource allocation scenarios. His people's approach to survival relied heavily on precise planning and technological solutions. The idea of operating without reliable computational support was almost incomprehensible. X7749's drones clustered closer together, their shared intelligence already working on contingency plans. But even their collective problem-solving abilities would be severely hampered without their usual technological interfaces. Marcus, meanwhile, was thinking about shelter. Not the climate-controlled habitats his fellow cadets were probably planning, but basic protection from wind and cold using materials that would be available on a frozen planet. His grandfather had been a survivalist back on Earth, and had taught Marcus that the difference between life and death often came down to understanding fundamental principles rather than relying on complex tools. The first lesson: cold killed faster than hunger. The second: wind made everything worse. The third: work with what the environment gave you, don't fight it. As the transport ship settled into its deployment pattern, Marcus noticed something his fellow cadets seemed to have missed. Through the viewport, he could see that the ice formations weren't random. They showed patterns of wind erosion, which meant prevailing wind directions. They showed layers of different ice types, which meant seasonal weather patterns. They showed natural sheltered areas where a person could find protection from the worst of the elements. His companions were studying their technological solutions. Marcus was reading the planet itself. The deployment pods were simple affairs, barely more than protective shells designed to get each cadet safely to the surface. As the bay doors opened and the pods launched in sequence, Marcus caught one last glimpse of his fellow trainees. Their expressions ranged from confident to concerned, but all of them were focused on their equipment, their plans, their technological approaches to the challenge ahead. Marcus closed his eyes as his pod detached from the ship and began its descent toward the frozen surface of Zirion 7. While the others were planning how to make their advanced tools work in primitive conditions, he was preparing to show them how primitive tools could accomplish seemingly impossible tasks. The pod hit the surface with a bone-jarring impact, skidding across the ice before coming to rest against a natural windbreak formed by compressed snow and ice. Marcus waited a moment for his vision to clear, then activated the pod's simple release mechanism and stepped out into a world that wanted him dead. The cold hit him like a physical blow, even through his thermal protection. The wind carried tiny ice crystals that stung any exposed skin and promised to find every gap in his clothing. The air itself seemed thin and hostile, each breath requiring conscious effort. But Marcus was smiling. Around him lay exactly what he needed: packed snow, wind-carved ice formations, scattered rocks that had been exposed by the constant movement of frozen air. His fellow cadets would see a hostile wasteland. Marcus saw building materials. He shouldered his simple pack and began walking toward a cluster of ice formations about half a kilometer away. While somewhere across this frozen landscape 200 of the galaxy's most advanced beings were probably setting up their technological solutions, Marcus Chen was about to demonstrate what human hands could accomplish when backed by human determination. The real test wasn't about surviving Zirion 7's brutal environment. It was about proving that sometimes the most primitive approach was the most effective one of all. The ice formations Marcus had spotted from his landing site turned out to be even better than he had hoped. Wind and time had carved them into natural windbreaks, with one formation creating an L-shaped barrier that would provide protection from the prevailing northwesterly winds. More importantly, the ice here was layered, hard, dense blue ice at the base with softer, more workable white ice above. Marcus dropped his pack and began his assessment of the area. The first rule his grandfather had taught him was to always understand your environment before you started changing it. He walked the perimeter of the natural shelter, noting wind patterns, drainage possibilities, and potential structural weaknesses. His breath came in sharp puffs that froze instantly in the thin air. The thermal protection suit he wore was designed for basic warmth, not extended exposure to temperatures that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. But, unlike his fellow cadets who were probably racing against their equipment's power limitations, Marcus had something they didn't: time. His tools wouldn't stop working. His hands wouldn't run out of power. His methods would work just as well on day 30 as they did on day 1. He pulled out his knife, a simple fixed blade his grandfather had forged from old automotive steel. No electronic components, no power source, no quantum matrices to be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. Just sharp metal and human muscle. Marcus began cutting blocks from the softer upper layer of ice, using a technique he had learned during winter survival training in Alaska. Each block was roughly the size of a cinder block, cut with smooth sides that would fit together tightly. The work was brutal, the knife handle bit into his gloved hands, and each cut required significant force to slice through the frozen material. But it was working. As he labored, Marcus could hear distant sounds carried on the wind. The high whine of quantum fabricators operating at maximum efficiency. The sharp crack of molecular bonds being rearranged. The electromagnetic buzz of alien technology working frantically to establish shelter before the planet's interference patterns disabled their equipment. His fellow cadets were in a race against time, trying to accomplish in hours what needed to last for weeks. Marcus was building something that would grow stronger as time passed. The ice block construction method was ancient by human standards, used by Earth's Arctic peoples for thousands of years. Each block was cut slightly smaller at the bottom than at the top, creating a natural arch that distributed weight evenly and became more stable under pressure. The technique required no advanced engineering knowledge, no computer calculations, just understanding of basic physics and enough patience to do the work properly. By the time the first of Zirion 7's 3 moons had risen above the horizon, Marcus had cut and placed nearly 40 blocks, creating a curved wall that would serve as the foundation for his shelter. His hands ached inside his gloves, and his shoulders burned from the constant motion of cutting and lifting, but the structure was taking shape exactly as he had planned. Then, he heard the first distress call. The emergency beacon was coming from perhaps 2 kilometers to his east, its signal weak and intermittent. Marcus paused in his work, listening to the pattern of beeps that indicated a cadet in serious trouble. Protocol called for immediate assistance when possible, but leaving his shelter construction now could mean losing hours of work and potentially failing to complete adequate protection before the temperature dropped even further during the night cycle. Marcus made his decision quickly. He gathered his rope and knife, leaving his pack secured beside his partially completed shelter, and began jogging toward the signal. The terrain between his position and the distress beacon was treacherous, uneven ice with hidden crevasses and wind-polished surfaces that offered little traction. Marcus moved carefully but steadily, using his knife as an ice pick when the footing became too uncertain to trust his boots alone. He found Commander Thexla trapped beneath his collapsed emergency shelter, the crystalline being's body flickering weakly as his internal energy reserves began to fail. The alien's molecular assembler lay nearby, its control matrix dark and unresponsive, another victim of Zirion 7's electromagnetic interference. Human Chen, Thexla's voice resonated with pain and embarrassment. My shelter construction sequence failed when the assembler lost power. The structure collapsed and pinned my lower extremities. I cannot generate sufficient force to free myself. Marcus quickly assessed the situation. The shelter was made from some kind of metallic foam that had hardened incorrectly when the assembler malfunctioned, creating a rigid trap instead of a flexible habitat. The weight was significant, but the material was also brittle. It could be broken with the right application of force. Instead of trying to lift the collapsed section, Marcus used his knife to score stress lines in the material, then applied pressure at specific points to create controlled fractures. It was a technique he had learned from demolition work during his civilian training. Sometimes the best way to remove something wasn't to fight its strength, but to redirect its failure. The metallic foam cracked along his scored lines, breaking into manageable pieces that he could lift away from Thexla's trap limbs. The crystalline being's relief was visible as his internal light patterns resumed their normal rhythm. Your methodology was unexpectedly effective, Thexla observed as he tested his freed extremities. My people would have attempted to calculate optimal stress distribution points and apply precise force vectors. Your approach was more intuitive. Marcus helped the alien to his feet. Sometimes you don't need to understand exactly why something works, you just need to understand how to make it work. Can you travel? Thexla took several experimental steps, his crystalline body showing no signs of damage. Affirmative. However, my shelter is completely compromised, and my technological resources are non-functional. I am not equipped for primitive survival techniques. The ethical choice was obvious, even if it complicated Marcus's own survival plans. Come with me. I'm building something that will work for both of us. They made their way back to Marcus's construction site as Zirion 7's second moon appeared in the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the wind was picking up, a potentially deadly combination for anyone without adequate shelter. Thexla observed Marcus's ice block construction with obvious fascination. This technique requires no external power source? No advanced materials? Just ice, time, and understanding how weight and pressure work together, Marcus replied, picking up his knife and resuming his cutting. Each block supports the ones around it. The more weight you add, the stronger the structure becomes. Working together, they made rapid progress. Thexla's crystalline body was incredibly strong, allowing him to lift blocks that would have required significant effort for Marcus to maneuver alone. More importantly, his precise nature meant that once Marcus showed him the cutting technique, Thexla could replicate it exactly, creating perfectly uniform blocks that fit together seamlessly. As they worked, Marcus explained the principles behind the construction. The slight inward angle of each course created a natural dome shape that would distribute wind pressure evenly across the structure. The entrance tunnel they were building would be lower than the main floor, creating a cold trap that would keep the warmest air inside the shelter. The small hole they would leave at the top would provide ventilation without allowing significant heat loss. Your species builds with mathematics expressed through physical manipulation, Thexla observed as they placed the final blocks at the dome's apex. The calculations exist, but they are intuitive rather than computed. Marcus secured the last block and stepped back to examine their work. The shelter was simple but solid, a dome of ice blocks about 3 meters in diameter with a low entrance tunnel and proper ventilation. It would be completely invisible to most electronic sensors, perfectly adapted to the local environment, and capable of maintaining habitable temperatures using nothing but body heat and basic physics. The calculations aren't intuitive, Marcus corrected as they gathered materials for insulation. They're just so fundamental that we don't think about them anymore. Humans have been building shelters like this for so long that the knowledge became instinctive. Inside the completed shelter, the temperature was already noticeably warmer than the outside air. Marcus showed Thexla how to arrange their gear to maximize insulation and heat retention, how to position their bodies to share warmth without compromising individual space, and how to manage condensation to prevent moisture buildup that could refreeze and damage their thermal protection. As they settled in for their first night on Zirion 7, Marcus could hear distant sounds that told the story of their fellow cadets' experiences. The occasional crack of failing structures. The whine of overloaded power systems. The sharp reports of emergency flares being fired to mark positions for potential rescue. But, inside their ice dome, warmed by their body heat and insulated by techniques older than interstellar travel, Marcus and Thexla were not just surviving, they were comfortable. "I begin to understand," Thexla said as his internal light patterns shifted to what Marcus had learned indicated contemplation among his species. "Your people's apparent technological primitiveness is actually a different form of sophistication. You have learned to work with fundamental forces directly rather than through technological intermediaries." Marcus smiled in the dim light that filtered through the ice blocks. "Technology is a tool. But tools break, run out of power, malfunction, or become obsolete. Understanding how things actually work, that never becomes useless." Outside, the wind howled across Zirion 7's frozen landscape, carrying with it the sounds of 200 of the galaxy's most advanced beings learning that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was also the most simple one. The real test had only just begun. Marcus woke to the sound of something large moving outside their ice shelter. The rhythmic crunching of footsteps in the snow was too heavy and too regular to be natural wind patterns. He touched Thexla's crystalline arm gently, and the alien's internal lights immediately shifted to an alert pattern. Through the ice blocks, they could see shadows moving in the pale light of Zirion 7's early morning. Multiple figures, moving with the coordination that suggested either pack hunters or organized search patterns. Marcus pressed his eye to one of the small gaps between blocks and saw what he had been expecting since they started hearing distress calls the night before. Other cadets, moving in groups, looking for shelter. The first group consisted of 5 Voltarian Empire cadets, their scale forms clearly suffering from the extreme cold despite their environmental suits. Their leader was Zara Th, who Marcus recognized from the transport. Her quantum fabricator hung from her belt, dark and useless after its brief operational window had expired. Behind them came a mixed group of species, 2 Medhoran gas forms whose containment suits were showing signs of energy drain, an insectoid cluster that had lost several drone units to the cold, and what appeared to be a crystalline Confederacy engineering team whose molecular assemblers had suffered catastrophic failure. "Human Chen," Zara Th called out, having spotted the shelter. "We have wounded. Request permission to approach." Marcus emerged from the entrance tunnel, noting immediately how much the assembled cadets were struggling. Several showed signs of hypothermia despite their protection suits. Others had makeshift bandages where emergency shelter failures had caused injuries. All of them looked like they had spent the night fighting a losing battle against the planet's harsh environment. "What's your situation?" Marcus asked, though he could already guess the answer from their appearance. A Medhoran officer stepped forward, his gaseous form barely contained within a suit that was clearly running on backup power. "Our technological solutions proved inadequate. Electromagnetic interference disabled our fabrication equipment after 6 hours as predicted, but the shelters we constructed in that time failed during the night temperature drop. We have 17 cadets suffering from exposure-related injuries and 3 whose life support systems are critically compromised." Marcus looked at the assembled group, calculating space and resources. His shelter could accommodate perhaps 4 beings the size of Thexla. 17 cadets plus their existing occupancy was impossible with their current structure. But impossible wasn't a word that registered correctly in the human lexicon. "Thexla, start expanding the shelter using the technique I showed you. Cut blocks from the formation to our east, the ice there is better quality. Marcus turned to the assembled cadets. Anyone who's not injured starts cutting and moving blocks. We're building an expansion that will house everyone. Zarath's scales rippled with confusion. Human Chen, the construction methodology you employed requires extensive time investment. Our wounded cannot survive extended exposure. Well, then, we work faster, Marcus interrupted, already moving toward the ice formation with his knife. And we work smarter. Fexla, show them the cutting technique. Everyone who can hold a tool starts making blocks. Everyone else gathers insulation material, anything organic, anything that can trap air. What followed was Marcus's first real demonstration of human problem-solving methodology applied to crisis management. While his fellow cadets had spent their first day trying to perfect individual solutions, he had spent it understanding the fundamental requirements of survival on this planet. Now he was scaling that understanding to accommodate 17 additional lives. The expanded shelter design was more complex than the simple dome, but it followed the same basic principles. Multiple connected chambers, each optimized for specific functions, sleeping areas arranged to maximize shared body heat, storage areas positioned to provide additional insulation, and a central common area where the group could coordinate activities. But the real innovation was in the construction methodology itself. Marcus organized the work teams based on species capabilities rather than traditional military hierarchy. The Voltarians' natural strength made them excellent block movers. The crystalline being's precision made them ideal for the detailed fitting work. The insectoid collective's coordination abilities made them perfect for managing the complex logistics of multi-chamber construction. Within 4 hours, they had expanded the original shelter into a complex that could comfortably house 20 beings. More importantly, Marcus had shown them construction techniques that could be replicated without advanced tools, how to cut interlocking blocks that became stronger under pressure, how to create ventilation systems that maintained breathable air without losing heat, how to design structural elements that worked with natural forces rather than against them. During the construction, Marcus noticed something that would become critically important in the days ahead. His fellow cadets were learning more than just survival techniques, they were beginning to understand the fundamental difference between human problem-solving and their own species' approaches. When Zarath's quantum fabricator had failed, she had been left with no alternative plan because her people approached challenges through technological superiority. When Fexla's molecular assembler malfunctioned, his species' precision-based methodology became useless because they had never developed improvisation skills. But Marcus's approach wasn't dependent on any specific tool or technology. His methods worked because they were based on understanding fundamental principles that remained constant regardless of technological availability. As they worked together to complete the expanded shelter complex, the assembled cadets began sharing their experiences from the previous night. The stories were remarkably consistent, advanced technological solutions that worked brilliantly for a few hours before failing catastrophically when power sources were exhausted or electromagnetic interference disrupted their operation. My people's approach to engineering emphasizes optimization through computational modeling, explained a crystalline Confederacy architect named Veltar as he carefully fitted ice blocks according to Marcus's specifications. We calculate optimal solutions and implement them precisely. But, when the computational systems fail, we have no methodology for adaptive problem solving. X-7749's remaining drones clustered around Marcus as he demonstrated how to create effective insulation using nothing but packed snow and salvaged materials. Our collective intelligence excels at resource allocation and parallel processing, but we require technological interfaces to coordinate effectively. Without our standard communication arrays, our efficiency drops dramatically. Marcus paused in his work to address the group that had gathered around him. Your species developed amazing technologies because you identified problems and created solutions that eliminated those problems. Humans took a different path, we developed techniques that worked around problems rather than eliminating them. He gestured toward their expanded shelter complex. This structure isn't optimal by your engineering standards. It's not as temperature-controlled as a powered habitat, not as precisely constructed as a molecular assembly, not as efficiently designed as a quantum fabrication. But it has something your solutions don't have, it works regardless of circumstances. That afternoon, they encountered their first example of Zirion 7's native predators. The creatures were perfectly adapted to the planet's harsh conditions, hexapodal hunters with electromagnetic sensory organs that could track technological signatures across vast distances. They had been drawn to the area by the energy emissions from the cadets' failed technological solutions. The predators were magnificent in their efficiency. Roughly the size of terrestrial polar bears but built for speed across ice, they moved in coordinated packs and showed clear evidence of intelligence. Their natural electromagnetic senses meant they could locate any powered equipment from kilometers away, but they seemed confused by the ice shelter complex that registered as nothing more than a natural formation. Marcus watched from a concealed position as the pack investigated the area where several cadets had attempted to establish technological shelters the previous day. The predators found every trace of artificial electromagnetic activity, but they passed within meters of the ice complex without showing interest. They hunt by tracking energy signatures, he explained quietly to his companions. Our shelter doesn't register as artificial because it doesn't emit anything they recognize as technology. Zaratich's scales showed patterns that Marcus was learning to recognize as impressed surprise. Your construction methodology provides concealment as well as environmental protection? It provides whatever you build it to provide, Marcus replied. That's the difference between working with natural materials and natural forces versus trying to impose artificial solutions on a natural environment. As the predator pack moved on, continuing their search for the electromagnetic signatures that would lead them to other cadet positions, Marcus began planning the next phase of their survival strategy. They had shelter that worked and would continue working regardless of technological failures. Now they needed sustainable resources: food, water, materials for tool construction and repair. But, more importantly, they needed to establish contact with the other cadet groups who were undoubtedly facing similar challenges across Zirion 7's frozen landscape. The predator behavior suggested that anyone still relying on technological solutions was painting a target on themselves, while anyone who had managed to adapt to primitive methods might be struggling with resource acquisition and long-term planning. Marcus had proven that human techniques could provide effective shelter. Now he needed to demonstrate how human adaptability could create sustainable survival systems that would keep them alive for the remaining 26 days of their training exercise. As the group settled into their new shelter complex for their second night on Zirion 7, Marcus could hear the satisfaction in their conversations. They had accomplished something that individually would have been impossible for most of them, and they had done it using techniques that any of them could now replicate independently. But the real lesson was just beginning. Shelter was only the first requirement of survival. Tomorrow, they would need to address the much more complex challenges of finding food and water on a planet where both were scarce and well hidden. Marcus smiled as he listened to his fellow cadets discussing their plans for the following day. They were beginning to think like humans, not seeking the optimal solution, but the solution that would work under any circumstances. The transformation had begun. The morning of Day 8 brought an unexpected development that would reshape the entire survival training exercise. Marcus was teaching Veltar how to identify the subtle differences in ice quality that indicated underground water sources when their basic communicators suddenly crackled to life with an emergency transmission. All cadets, this is Captain Rodriguez. We have received multiple distress signals from across the training zone. 17 groups have reported critical resource depletion and are requesting emergency extraction. Training Command is implementing Protocol 7. Marcus paused in his demonstration, catching the worried expressions of his companions. Protocol 7 was something they had studied but hoped never to experience: a fundamental breakdown in training exercise parameters that required command intervention. The captain's voice continued. All cadets in stable condition are directed to assist their struggling counterparts. This is no longer an individual survival exercise. This is now a species integration survival training operation. Your objective is to ensure that all 200 cadets survive the remaining 23 days using collaborative methodologies. Zaratich's scales rippled with concern. They're converting a competitive exercise into a cooperative one. That suggests widespread failure of individual survival strategies. Thexla's crystalline body pulsed with rapid calculations. If 17 groups have already requested extraction, the failure rate among technologically dependent strategies is approximately 43%. Extrapolating from current trends, total mission failure becomes probable within 10 days. Marcus was thinking about something else entirely. 17 groups in crisis meant roughly 85 cadets whose survival depended on techniques that weren't working. But, more importantly, it meant an opportunity to demonstrate that human methodologies could be taught, learned, and adapted by other species. "This changes everything," he said, shouldering his pack. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're teaching survival." Over the next several hours, they received specific coordinates for the cadet groups in crisis. The pattern was exactly what Marcus had expected. All were located in exposed positions where technological shelters had failed, all were showing signs of resource depletion, and all were clustered around the remnants of sophisticated equipment that had promised to solve their survival problems before becoming useless metal and crystal. The first group they reached was perhaps the most dramatic example of the gap between technological capability and practical survival skills. 8 cadets from the hegemony of evolved minds had constructed what appeared to be a small city using their molecular assemblers, complete with powered habitats, automated resource collection systems, and environmental control networks. It was a masterpiece of engineering that had worked flawlessly for exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes. Now it was a collection of dead machinery surrounding 8 of the galaxy's most intelligent beings, who were slowly freezing to death because they had never learned to start a fire without technological assistance. "We calculated optimal resource utilization patterns and implemented perfect efficiency protocols," explained their leader, Intellectus Prime 7, his enhanced brain housing clearly struggling with power conservation mode. "Our error was not in execution but in fundamental assumptions about environmental stability." Marcus surveyed their failed installations while his team began gathering the materials they would need for another shelter expansion. The evolved minds had built efficiently, but they had built for a controlled environment. Every system required power, every solution depended on technological integration, every backup plan relied on equipment that was now non-functional. "Your calculations were correct for the assumptions you made," Marcus said as he began marking locations for ice block cutting. "But survival isn't about creating optimal conditions. It's about thriving in suboptimal conditions." What followed was Marcus's first large-scale demonstration of adaptive teaching methodology. Each species learned differently, processed information through different cognitive frameworks, and had different physical capabilities. A teaching approach that worked for the precision-oriented crystalline beings would be useless for the collective intelligence insectoids, and neither would be effective for the enhanced brain-evolved minds. So Marcus developed multiple teaching tracks simultaneously. For the crystalline beings, he presented survival techniques as engineering problems with specific mathematical relationships. The angle of ice block cutting wasn't about right, it was exactly 15.7 degrees from vertical, creating a compressive arch that distributed 2.3 times more load than a vertical stack. For the insectoids, he structured learning as collaborative projects where different drones could specialize in different techniques while maintaining collective knowledge. One drone learned fire starting, another mastered ice identification, a third focused on tool construction, and all shared their knowledge through their electromagnetic communication network. For the evolved minds, he framed primitive techniques as elegant solutions to complex multivariable problems. Starting a fire without technological assistance wasn't crude, it was an exercise in applied chemistry, physics, and materials science that required understanding oxidation rates, heat transfer principles, and combustion dynamics. The teaching process revealed something remarkable about human problem solving that Marcus himself hadn't fully understood before. Human survival techniques weren't just practical methodologies, they were comprehensive educational systems that taught fundamental principles through hands-on application. When Intellectus Prime 7 learned to start a fire using a bow drill, he wasn't just learning to create heat. He was learning about friction coefficients, tinder preparation, oxygen flow management, and sustainable fuel consumption. More importantly, he was learning that understanding principles was more valuable than memorizing procedures. When X7749's drones learned to construct water collection systems using nothing but carved ice channels and salvaged materials, they weren't just solving hydration problems. They were learning about gravity flow dynamics, thermal expansion principles, and integrated system design that functioned without external power sources. When Veltar learned to read weather patterns by observing cloud formations and wind patterns, he wasn't just predicting environmental conditions. He was learning to process real-time environmental data through direct observation rather than technological sensors. But the most important lesson was happening at a deeper level. Each species was discovering that their technological dependence had created cognitive blind spots that limited their ability to adapt to unexpected situations. On day 12, they encountered a perfect example of this limitation when an electromagnetic storm disabled even their basic communicators and emergency beacons. The storm was more intense than anything the planet had produced during their training, turning the sky into a writhing display of electrical discharge that made electronic equipment not just useless but dangerous to carry. The technologically dependent cadets panicked. Without their communication devices, they couldn't coordinate with their teams. Without their sensors, they couldn't navigate effectively. Without their emergency beacons, they couldn't call for extraction if the situation became life-threatening. But Marcus's group continued their activities without significant disruption. They navigated by reading terrain features and tracking the movement of Zirion 7's moons. They communicated through hand signals and vocal calls that carried effectively across the ice. They coordinated activities through direct observation and established protocols that didn't require electronic confirmation. Your methodologies function independently of technological infrastructure, observed Intellectus Prime 7 as he watched Marcus demonstrate how to determine direction using shadow patterns during the storm's brief clear periods. This provides operational security that our approaches lack. It's not about being independent of technology, Marcus corrected as he showed the enhanced being how to use natural landmarks for navigation. It's about technology being dependent on understanding, not the other way around. When you understand how things work fundamentally, you can use whatever tools are available, including no tools at all. The electromagnetic storm lasted for 3 days, during which Marcus's group not only maintained their survival systems but actually expanded them to accommodate 6 more cadet groups who had been forced to abandon their technological solutions. By the time the storm cleared, they had created a complex of interconnected shelters that housed 43 cadets from 12 different species. More importantly, they had established a working demonstration of how primitive techniques could be scaled to support large populations without losing efficiency or sustainability. The storm had also provided an unexpected benefit. It had forced rapid skill transfer among the assembled cadets. When technological communication failed, they had developed working relationships based on direct cooperation and shared physical tasks. Species that had never worked together before discovered they could coordinate effectively when they focused on common goals rather than technological compatibility. When their communicators finally came back online on day 15, the transmission they received from Training Command was unlike anything in the recorded history of Galactic Military Academy exercises. All cadet groups, this is Captain Rodriguez. Long-range sensors indicate that 47% of training participants have now consolidated into cooperative survival communities. This level of interspecies collaboration was not anticipated in the exercise parameters, but it represents a significant advancement in joint operational capabilities. Marcus smiled as he listened to reports from across the training zone. Other cadet groups had begun implementing variations of the techniques his team had developed. Improvised shelters constructed from local materials were replacing failed technological solutions. Resource-sharing networks were developing between groups that had previously operated in complete isolation. The survival exercise was becoming something unprecedented, a real-time demonstration of how human adaptability principles could be integrated with alien cognitive capabilities to create hybrid approaches that were more effective than either species could achieve alone. But the real test was still coming. The extraction point coordinates would be transmitted on day 28, and reaching that point would require coordinated movement of nearly 200 cadets across unknown terrain and conditions that could change without warning. Marcus was about to discover whether the lessons they had learned about individual survival could be scaled up to group logistics and strategic planning under pressure. The transformation from survival training to leadership development was about to accelerate beyond anything the Academy had ever recorded. Day 28 arrived with a transmission that changed everything Marcus thought he understood about the training exercise. The extraction point coordinates came through their communicators at dawn, but they weren't for a simple pickup location. Instead, they revealed something that made every cadet across Zirion 7 realize they had been participating in something far more significant than survival training. All cadets, Captain Rodriguez's voice carried an unusual tone of satisfaction over the comm system. Your extraction point is the wreckage of a Class 7 exploration vessel located at coordinates 127.4 by 89.6. The vessel contains 43 survivors who have been stranded on Zirion 7 for 18 standard days. Your mission is no longer survival training. Your mission is search and rescue using the techniques and methodologies you have developed during your time on this planet. Marcus felt the assembled cadets around him shift from confident anticipation to sudden understanding of the stakes involved. This wasn't an exercise anymore, it was a real operation with real lives depending on their success. Zaratich's scale showed the rapid color changes that indicated intense calculation. A Class 7 vessel would carry a standard complement of 212 beings. If only 43 survived the crash, the casualty rate approaches 80%. The remaining survivors have been exposed to Zirion 7's conditions for 18 days with whatever emergency equipment survived the impact. Thexla's crystalline body pulsed with the rapid light patterns that meant he was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously. Our own technological solutions proved inadequate after 6 hours of exposure. Commercial exploration crews would not possess military-grade survival equipment. Their situation is almost certainly critical. But Marcus was thinking about something different. The coordinates placed the crash site nearly 60 kilometers from their current position, across terrain that included exposed ice fields, unstable formations, and areas where the electromagnetic interference was so intense that even their basic communicators would be unreliable. Moving nearly 200 cadets across that distance while maintaining the survival systems they had built would have been impossible using traditional military logistics. But they weren't using traditional logistics anymore, they had developed something entirely new during their time on Zirion 7. We're not moving as individual groups or even as a single unit, Marcus announced to the assembled leaders of the 12 cadet communities that had formed across their section of the training zone. We're moving as a mobile civilization. What Marcus proposed was unprecedented in military doctrine. Instead of abandoning their shelters and attempting rapid movement to the extraction point, they would disassemble their constructions in stages, moving the materials and techniques forward in a coordinated progression that maintained survival capability throughout the journey. The plan required a complete rethinking of movement logistics, but it was based on principles that had kept human nomadic cultures alive for millennia. Each day's movement would cover approximately 15 kilometers while establishing a new temporary settlement capable of supporting the entire group overnight. Materials from the previous settlement would be transported forward and integrated into the new construction, creating a rolling wave of sustainable infrastructure. It sounded impossible to beings who thought in terms of technological solutions and optimal efficiency. But Marcus had learned something during his weeks on Zirion 7 that his fellow cadets were just beginning to understand. Impossible was a concept that only existed when you approached problems with rigid assumptions about how solutions had to work. The movement began on day 29 with a coordination exercise that demonstrated how much the assembled cadets had learned about collaborative problem solving. Each species contributed their specific capabilities to roles that maximized group efficiency. Voltarian strength moved the heavy structural materials. Crystalline precision handled the detailed planning and resource allocation. Insectoid coordination managed the complex logistics of equipment distribution and task scheduling. But the real innovation was in how Marcus had structured the leadership hierarchy. Instead of traditional military command structure based on rank and species authority, leadership rotated based on situational expertise. When they needed to identify safe routes across unstable ice, the evolved mind's computational abilities took precedence. When they needed to establish shelter systems quickly, the human's adaptive building techniques guided the effort. When they needed to coordinate complex multi-group activities, the insectoid collective intelligence provided organizational framework. By the end of the first day's movement, they had traveled 18 kilometers and established a temporary settlement that was actually more sophisticated than their original shelters. The techniques they had learned during the past weeks hadn't just been preserved during movement, they had been improved through the necessity of rapid deployment and the integration of ideas from multiple species. On the second day, they encountered the first evidence of the crashed exploration vessel's survivors. Emergency shelters that had been constructed using standard commercial survival equipment, then abandoned when that equipment failed under Zirion 7's harsh conditions. Supply caches that showed the organized approach of trained exploration personnel, followed by increasingly desperate improvisation as resources ran low. More disturbing were the signs that indicated some survivors had attempted to reach safety using technological solutions that guaranteed failure on this planet. Tracks leading toward the most electromagnetically active areas, where sensor equipment would have indicated the presence of energy sources that didn't actually exist. Equipment discarded along routes that led away from natural shelter and toward geographical features that offered no protection from the environment. They're applying exploration protocols designed for standard planetary environments, observed Intellectus Prime 7 as he analyzed the abandoned supply cache they discovered near a failed technological shelter. Their training emphasized technological self-sufficiency and rapid establishment of communication with rescue operations. But, on Zirion 7, both strategies are counterproductive. Marcus studied the tracks leading away from the cache, reading the story they told with skills his grandfather had taught him during hunting expeditions in Alaska. 3 survivors left this position moving northeast approximately 4 days ago. They were carrying standard emergency equipment, which means they're probably looking for high ground where they can establish long-range communication. Zaratich's scales rippled with concern as she identified the terrain features in that direction. The northeastern highlands contain the most intense electromagnetic activity on this continent. Any technological equipment would not merely fail, it would be destroyed by the energy patterns there. The rescue mission became a race against time and physics. The exploration vessel's survivors were operating under protocols that were actively endangering them, while Marcus's group possessed knowledge that could save their lives. But, the distance involved and the deteriorating weather patterns meant that standard approach methods wouldn't work. Marcus made a decision that demonstrated exactly how much human problem-solving methodology had influenced the entire group's thinking. Instead of attempting to follow the survivors' trail directly, they would use Zirion 7's natural systems to intercept them at a point where rescue would be possible. The plan required understanding weather patterns, terrain features, and human behavior patterns in crisis situations. The electromagnetic storms that made the northeastern highlands so dangerous followed predictable patterns based on the planet's magnetic field interactions with its 3 moons. The survivors would be forced to take shelter during the worst periods, which would limit their movement to specific time windows. Most importantly, their deteriorating condition would force them to follow the paths of least resistance, which meant predictable route choices. Marcus coordinated the rescue operation using principles of strategic planning that were entirely human in origin but had been enhanced by alien cognitive capabilities. Instead of linear pursuit, they used pattern prediction. Instead of direct confrontation with the environmental hazards, they used environmental knowledge to position themselves advantageously. The rescue itself, when it finally occurred on day 31, was a textbook demonstration of how primitive techniques could accomplish what technological solutions couldn't. They found the 3 survivors huddled in an inadequate shelter constructed from salvaged hull plating, slowly dying from exposure and dehydration despite carrying emergency equipment that should have kept them alive for weeks. Their technological solutions had failed so completely that they were worse off than if they had been carrying no equipment at all. Marcus's team extracted them using ice sleds pulled by coordinated cadet teams, transported them to shelter constructed from materials available on site, and treated their hypothermia using body heat sharing techniques that required no external power sources. More importantly, they did it in weather conditions that would have prevented any technological rescue operation from functioning. The return to the main crash site with the rescued survivors became a demonstration of how effective the hybrid methodologies had become. They moved as a coordinated unit of over 200 beings, maintaining multiple simultaneous operations: rescue, construction, logistics, navigation, and communication without relying on any technology more sophisticated than basic tools and human organizational principles. When they finally reached the crashed exploration vessel and its remaining survivors, Marcus discovered that their rescue operation had become something unprecedented in Galactic Military Academy history. They had transformed from students learning survival techniques into an effective multi-species rescue organization capable of operating in conditions that would challenge professional emergency response teams. The 43 survivors they extracted from the wreckage were in significantly worse condition than the 3 they had rescued earlier, but they were alive because they had remained near the crash site rather than attempting to reach rescue using failed technological approaches. The rescue and treatment operations required everything the cadets had learned about sustainable resource management, adaptive construction techniques, and collaborative problem-solving under pressure. Captain Rodriguez arrived with the official extraction team on day 34 to find something that fundamentally challenged the Academy's understanding of interspecies cooperation and primitive technology applications. Instead of 200 exhausted cadets waiting for rescue, he discovered a functioning civilization that had solved complex logistical problems using techniques that most advanced species had forgotten were possible. Cadet Chen, the captain said as he surveyed the elaborate complex of shelters, workshops, medical facilities, and coordination centers that had been constructed entirely from ice, salvaged materials, and human engineering principles. Your performance report is going to require an entirely new category of evaluation criteria. Marcus smiled as he watched his fellow cadets demonstrating the techniques they had learned to Rodriguez's extraction team. Voltarians teaching human ice-cutting methods to professional engineers. Crystalline beings explaining how primitive construction could be more reliable than molecular assembly. Insectoids coordinating resource distribution using protocols based on human logistics principles. Captain, Marcus replied, gesturing toward the complex where 43 exploration survivors were recovering using medical techniques that combined alien biological knowledge with human adaptive care principles. I think we've proved that sometimes the most advanced approach is also the most fundamental one. The extraction itself became a demonstration that would be studied at the Academy for years afterward. Instead of abandoning their constructions, the cadets disassembled them systematically, creating portable survival kits that would allow any of them to establish sustainable shelter using nothing but materials available on any planet. But, more importantly, they had learned to think like humans while retaining their species' cognitive advantages. They had discovered that technology was most powerful when it enhanced understanding rather than replacing it. As their transport ships departed Zirion 7's orbit, Marcus looked back at the planet that had tested not just their ability to survive, but their ability to adapt, learn, and teach each other. The frozen wasteland that had nearly killed them had become the classroom where they learned that the most primitive techniques were often the most sophisticated solutions. The human way wasn't about rejecting advanced technology, it was about understanding that all technology worked best when it was built on a foundation of fundamental principles that never became obsolete. In the end, they had done more than survive Zirion 7. They had learned to thrive there. And, in teaching that ability to each other, they had created something that would reshape how the galaxy approached problems that couldn't be solved with technology alone. Sometimes the most important lessons were also the oldest ones.